Thanks, Terry, and good morning, everybody. I am David Andison, the program lead for the Healthy Landscapes program, as Terry said. I'm a consultant working here in the interior of BC, an adjunct professor at UBC. Yeah, and that's who I am for those of you who don't know me. So I am going to turn my camera off so everyone, well, so you don't have to look at me, and we can talk about my presentation. So here we go. So what is ecosystem-based management? And here we are. Let me just move this over. Okay. So the first question is, first question is, why is my screen frozen? Hold on. There we go. Okay, the first question is why. So there is a story behind this that's relevant. So for the Healthy Landscapes program and its predecessor, the Natural Disturbance program, we have been working for about 25 years now, since 1996. And starting about 5 years ago, some of the partners started to notice that the uptake on some of the research wasn't what they were hoping it would be. And so that led us to actually do what we called some dialogue sessions. So we did ecosystem-based EBM dialogue sessions, 4 of them across Alberta, 2 in the north, 2 in the south. And it wasn't about indoctrinating or educating, it was more about listening to other people. And what we were hoping for is to get a broad range of perspective, just to try to understand where people were coming from as it related to EBM, and have a chance to talk to each other and listen to each other. And that final report is available. I can send that to anyone interested. But this was one of the more interesting outcomes from that process. So we had John Parkins from U of A involved as a social scientist, and he did a survey before the sessions and then after the sessions for each of the participants. And one of the questions was, are you likely to recommend EBM to others? And pre-dialogue on the left, post-dialogue on the right. So what happened here is, even though the numbers are very high, they actually went down after the session. And what was happening here is that during the session, people were realizing over the course of the day that their definition of EBM was not shared by others. And so that's the reason why it went down, is that people were realizing, okay, if it's, I like my definition of EBM, but yours and yours and yours, I'm not so keen on. So the recommendation for EBM actually went down. And we saw this during the day just as a part of our observations of people realizing we're not all talking about the same thing. And that was a real eye-opener for us. So, one of the outcomes from that, and then a subsequent workshop on EBM, is what we have to do is not necessarily talk about what EBM is, period, but rather understand where others are coming from. So if we are a program that's looking at ecosystem-based management as our premise, we'd better be really clear about what we mean by it. And by that, we mean crystal clear on our version. We're not saying that it's the right one, because I don't think there is a right version or a right definition of EBM, but here's ours. So we have to walk the walk, and that's what people were telling us during the dialogue sessions and the workshop. It's also providing context for past and future HLP projects. So if you take a look at some of the past projects that we're doing, or even some of the ones now, it's easy to look at them and say, what does this have to do with the Healthy Landscapes program? And actually, by defining what we mean, our definition, not the right one, not the only one, but what we mean by that when we say it, it helps put projects into context. It also helps shift the conversation. So you can imagine if you're walking into a room and you're talking about EBM, and if you do not understand what each other is talking about, then you're not even talking the same language. So your chances of agreeing or even understanding or listening to each other go way down. So we've got to be speaking the same language. And again, it's not about being right. And lastly, through both the workshop and the dialogue sessions and my conversations with other people on EBM, it fairly widespread observation that when these conversations about what this term means, when they didn't happen, the idea was either thrown out or it was imposed with very uneven success. So again, if we're going to move forward as a program, then we are going to get our version out there, and we can at least move the conversation to the next level. I'm not trying to convince anyone today this is the right version of EBM. This is how we came up with it. So I would say for the most part, when a lot of people hear the word EBM, they immediately go to a forestry application. And this is an example on the left of a traditional forest management plan that's multiple paths, an aerial view, and in the purple are harvest blocks and the yellow are roads. And on the right is the a more of a natural plan that looks more like a forest fire. And so here's and so that to a lot of people in forest management is what EBM is. And I'm going to argue that it's actually a lot more than that. That's a part of it, but that's not the whole thing. So where do we start? We do know quite a bit about EBM as a baseline. So first, it's an idea. It's a paradigm. It's not something you either do or you don't do. This is an adapted diagram that Fred Swanson came up with about 15 years ago, and it's interesting in that it's a different version of how the world works and different paradigms fit into it. And that's sort of my big blob of where EBM fits in there. But the lesson here is that EBM is an aspirational thing. It's not either there or it isn't. It's not something you either do or you don't. It's aspirational. It's something that we strive towards. And I'll speak more about this later. But that's the idea behind an idea, behind a paradigm. It's something that you travel towards. It also means if it's an idea, it probably needs some significant translation. So there's two big lessons there. Second, it's not a new idea, and it's not even a forest management idea. It was used years before forest management started to take a look at it. And it has been used in intertidal areas, agriculture, grazing, rivers. The picture on the right that didn't turn out very well is supposed to be a river and woody debris. So there's lots of things we can learn from others. That's our second lesson. And third, versions of EBM are like belly buttons. Everybody has one. And what I found is that the more recent versions tended to stray further from the original definitions. And of course, they're going to be created to suit individual purposes and individual agendas. So rather than go through all of the literature on EBM, which I actually have done, but I'm not going to share it, the idea here is the lesson learned is go back to the source. Go back to where it started as close as possible, which is what I did. So trying to be as objective as possible, but recognizing subjectivity has to come into it, and I'll be upfront with that. So the reference material I used is, first of all, it has to be published. And that means peer-reviewed and public, not an internal document, not something that's used as educational or marketing material. Published literature seminal, and by that I mean as far back as possible. I think all of the papers are pre-2000, so at least 20 years old, some of them closer to 30. And broad-based, but a small number. I didn't want to be still looking at 50 or 100 for this exercise. And then second, it still has to be translated into specific activities and outcomes. So you have to see yourself in this somewhere. It can't be, remember, it's aspirational and it's an idea, and ideas need translating into the real world. So that's my backdrop for what I'm about to show you. So who are the mothers and the fathers of EBM? And these are sort of a list of names that some of you will recognize. Some of them I actually know and have spoken to. So there is a sort of a recognized list of people who were publishing articles back in the late 80s and early 90s on this topic and talking about the concept. So I ended up with 9 papers, and I winnowed the number down to 9 because I wanted to show my work, essentially. And so what I did is I looked for major ideas, major elements, and I came up with 13. And so here on the y-axis there are the 13 elements, and on the x-axis there are the papers. Now I will tell you that everything I'm going to talk about today is going to be combined into a report. So all of the details on the papers, the authors, and these elements will be in that paper. I'm not going to speak to every single one of them. But one of the things I wanted to point out here is that even of these 13 elements, you take a look across here, even these, seminal papers, they don't all agree on the 13. So even, the people who were talking about the idea of EBM at the very start, their versions were all slightly different from each other. And I wanted to recognize that as well. The other thing to notice here is that, some of them are fairly, again, they're ideas. And so some of them are sort of direct advice. So down here, manage at multiple scales. That's one that's easy to translate. Ecological boundaries, another one. But some of them not so much. Number 7 here, sustainability is defined by the system, not human needs. That's one that would need a translation. So the next step was to take these 13 elements, and again, I'm not going to read them all here, but here's the theoretical elements, and create practical elements, something that can be translated into the real world. So that was my next step, is to translate one from the other, and the X's just indicate here, again, the details aren't important, they're in the larger paper, where the crossover occurred. And this was a subjective exercise, I fully admit that, which is why I wanted to be completely open about the translation. So from the practical perspective, the elements break down into 4 groups. The first is philosophical. Why are we managing? What is it that we think we're managing? The second is partnerships. Who do we do this with? The third is process. How do we do this? And the fourth is technical. And here are the EBM elements. So here's the practical ones. I'm not going to go through them all necessarily, but I wanted to point out a couple of things. First of all, down here, notice the technical, which includes natural patterns, variation, and choosing targets. That tends to be where forest management is with association to EBM. Just on the technical side, not so much philosophical, process, and partnerships. And again, isn't a judgment saying that it's right or wrong. I'm just pointing out here's where the differences are from my perspective between the original versions of EBM and how forest management has been interpreting it. The other thing to notice is that a lot of these items here are things that we actually are striving to do now, potentially associated with other reasons. So there's a lot of win-win situations here. A lot of it, having to do with with partnerships in particular, that are very relevant to EBM. So the next step, what does a transition look like? It's one thing to describe all, each of these and what they look like, and again, the larger report does that. So there still has to be a description of what that might look like. Some of them are pretty easy. For example, the idea of having partnerships. Essentially more is better is the only rule. If you have all of your overlapping neighbors and geographic neighbors in terms of tenure and stakeholders and partners involved in management and in decision making, that's a very EBM thing to do. And it doesn't require a lot of description. The technical parts, we're getting pretty good at that now. There's, I would say Ontario and Quebec are kind of leading the way there in terms of creating, in Quebec it's called Closer to Nature, and their Forestry Act has actually been replaced with something that is called an Ecosystem Management Act. So that's not something we need to, we're pretty good at that as well. But for some of these, it does require some translation, and I'm just going to take you through, one of them. So this first one here is pretty important. So I'm just going to walk you through an example of what that might look like. How is natural pattern knowledge, or NRV, how is it used? So I will walk you through that. And to do so, some of you have seen me explain this before, but it comes in handy in this case. So this is my simplified model of how we make decisions right now. The planning and management system is at the top, and it's there for a reason. In this case, the foundation is timber harvest, natural resource extraction. In this case, timber harvesting, mining, even hunting and fishing. That's sort of the foundation. And then in the middle here, we have filters. And we've had this system for decades, essentially. The tools have changed, the sophistication has changed, and the number of filters has changed. As the managers out there are quite aware, and this is only a tiny fraction of them, but essentially, if there were no filters, we would just, it would be back to, the way it was in the 20s and 30s, 100 years ago, where, there was no reason not to take all the wood we wanted to. And of course, now there are a large number of filters between the foundation and the management and planning systems. So with that as background, and again, I didn't get this out of a book, I just made it up. It's Dave's version of how we manage. So moving from left to right then, a non-EBM version was we're not using natural patterns at all. Taking a step closer towards EBM, which is where some of us are today, is that we would use natural patterns, or NRV, as what I would call a secondary filter. So it's not up front the way something like woodland caribou is today, but it still comes into consideration. A next step towards EBM would be as what I would call a parallel filter, and it just means it sort of gets promoted. So natural patterns would be closer to the foundation, and then the next logical step is that it becomes a primary filter. I would say again that we're probably now somewhere between secondary and primary, or parallel filter. Maybe in a few cases it would be a primary filter. So the next step would be natural patterns become the foundation, and harvesting. So what happened here is that harvesting and natural patterns, they switch places. Okay, and that's a pretty big step, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a couple of minutes here. But essentially, the whole reason for managing the landscape is ecosystem health through natural patterns. All of these other things become filters, and harvesting actually becomes a tool or a way to get there. So I'll give you one example of what that might look like. This is an example of the difference between using NRV as a planning foundation and using it as a filter. So on the left-hand side, what we did is we took the whole Upper Athabasca area. So this is the foothills right here is the Rocky Mountains, Jasper, Banff, Hinton, and we ran it through sort of a traditional scenario using Patchworks, which is a forest management planning model that is spatial, that does sort of pseudo optimization. And in this case, the optimization is largely to do with the amount and the size and the type and the profile of harvesting material, and also delivered wood costs. So this is what the landscape would look and ends up looking like on the left. And dark green is old forest. So in the national parks, the reason there's a lot of dark green is that the business as usual amount of prescribed burning doesn't keep up with the historical level of burning that was happening. And so the buildup of old forest is, well, it's obvious. In the managed part of the landscape, even though it looks like there's not a lot of dark green there, there is, but it's in very small patches, and that's because we didn't control for it. And this was existing harvest levels. The one on the right, what we did is we changed up the rules for Patchworks, and we had the driving force be the size and the amount of old forest, and to come as close as possible to the historic levels. And so and then harvesting and prescribed burning became filters, and they were part of the output. So this is sort of an extreme example, but it gives you an idea of what the idea of using EBM as a foundation means. And I'm not necessarily saying that this is it's an appropriate or the right way to go. This was an experiment. This is a policy scenario exercise just to see what would happen, and sort of exploring what would happen. So that's just one example of for that very first one, of the transition between our business as usual we're doing today with no EBM, and a full-on EBM scenario. But it does raise a couple of good points. So first of all, there are 11 pieces to this puzzle. So it's not just here's our one-line definition of EBM, but here are 11 elements to it that are hopefully more clear. And so for each one of those, yes, it would be better if we could have more examples. And what we have right now is another project that's ongoing called the EBM Demonstration Cooperative. And as part of that project, we have one part of a new website that explains, again, our version of what EBM is. And then the second part of that website is are case studies, and the case studies relate to ultimately all 11 of those elements, and different positions on the spectrum, from no EBM to full EBM, different ways of looking at partnerships, different ways of installations on the ground, of something as simple as feathering and feathering forest edges, and integrating fire with forest management, prescribed burn with forest management. So all kinds of opportunities there. And the idea here is to, well, first of all, talk the same language. Again, not that this is the right definition, but it is a fully fledged definition that has a translation, and it is based in science. And so at least we're all talking the same language now when we say it's Healthy Landscapes EBM, whatever that means. But the idea is for this website, we hope to become a national website. So we can look at examples from Ontario, Quebec, Northwest Territories, BC, that everyone can share their experiences, and we're not reinventing the wheel. That we can see what each other is doing. And also, it would be a good way of planning future work. Where can we go next? So, do you have to be doing all 11, and do you have to be all the way over here? Obviously, the answer here is no to both of those. This is aspirational. It's an intent, it's a direction of travel. So you want to be deliberately saying, we're going to pick 1 or 2 or 3 of these and start to move them from left to right, whatever that looks like. And it'll be our version, or we can borrow from somebody else. And there's going to be other reasons why it's not always possible or acceptable, either socially, economically, or even ecologically, why you might not want to be all the way over on the right-hand side. And those are important. It's important to understand the nature and the type of those challenges and barriers as well. And there's also some opportunities in there, theoretically. So to better understand those, we have another project that is ongoing that's looking at exactly that question. So what are, for each of these 11 elements, what's preventing us from moving from left to right? Some of it are going to be pretty big and meaty. Policy, tenure. Some of it is going to be just habit. We've never done it that way before. There's no reason that we can't. There's no rule in place, but I'm not comfortable. Some of it is going to be trust. Like, well, why are you trying to, well, let's, pick an extreme example, but a real one. Why are you trying to start to do disturbance in riparian zones? I don't trust that you have the right motives for that. So again, there's going to be lots of looking forward to the final report on this project, and that hopefully that information will get integrated into the same website as well. So that's not the end. This is just the start. As I said at the beginning, there's lots of reasons for doing this, for putting ourselves out there and saying, here's our version of EBM. It's not the right one. It's not the only one, but at least you understand where we're coming from, and our conversations can go from there. So there'll be a quick note that will have a much briefer version of this talk. There will be a final report that I'm working on right now that will have much more detail, and we'll talk about each of those 11 elements. It'll give you all of the background information on the papers that I chose and why I chose them. As I said, there'll be a new EBM website. John Wilmshurst, the program coordinator, is working on this with myself and Rick Bonnar, and we will have case studies and some of this material on EBM on that website. That should be coming online, I'm going to say, in the next 6 months. And then another report by Rick Bonnar on challenges and opportunities of EBM. So there's a package deal coming your way on all of this. And just because I didn't use a fire picture, I can keep my record clean at 100% and have a fire picture in every single presentation I've done. So here it is.